think we'll get started. So you're all very welcome to this Quest seminar. And we have a few people here in Ors Myola, and we also have people tuning in online, so you're very welcome. And our host today is Dr. Caroline Bradbury-Jones, and we're delighted to have her here in Galway. And she is a registered nurse and midwife who's a reader in nursing at the University of Birmingham, where she leads the Risk, Abuse and Violence Research Programme. And she's particularly interested in research methodologies. So today she's going to talk about how we're doing an analysis of the state of qualitative research and implications for trials. For those of you on the webinar, there's a Q&A box, so if you want to type in your questions, and I can ask those questions at the end of the seminar. So we're delighted to have Caroline here, so I'll hand over to Caroline.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Rena, and indeed thank you very much for inviting me here to present and to run this webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's my first time in Galway, and what a beautiful place this is. So as Rena's just indicated, I'm going to talk about qualitative research, and as indicated in the title, the analysis is about the state of qualitative research, and I'm going to talk about two important things, all the time trying to tie it into qualitative research in trials or with trials. So I'm really going to focus on the place of theory and also the methodologies that we use as qualitative researchers. Context is really important in qualitative research. We all appreciate that. So I'm going to say just a little bit more about me so that you can orientate where I'm coming from. As Rena has said, my clinical background is in nursing, midwifery, and also public health nursing. I spent a lot of time as a public health nurse. And my particular area of interest is in domestic violence. And I've made that my research bread and butter, really, for the last 10, 12 years or so. But alongside actually doing research and thinking about qualitative research, I've been very interested for several years about what we do with qualitative research, and somewhere underlying that about the quality of what we're doing within qualitative research. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm quite open to challenges, for questions from those who are joining on the webinar and those in the room about what I'm saying, because when we are thinking about the quality of qualitative research, there can be some objective measures for sure, and some people have been critical of those. But what I'm talking about has without doubt involved a level of subjectivity and judgments and my own biases, I suppose. So let's join in the debate and the critique as we go on and actually after the webinar. Just move on somehow. Which one shall I use to move on? Because that doesn't seem to be okay. Magic. You did
just click the right, the left.
That's what I thought I did. Anyway, here we go. So over the years, qualitative research generally has had some critics, and it's been quite an interesting read for me when I've been undertaking my own critiques and grounding my own inquiries about the state of qualitative research. And when I was undertaking my own PhD, part of my study anyway was informed by phenomenology. So I really got to grips with some of the debates and critiques around the use of phenomenology specifically, and came across the work of people like Michael Crotty and John Paley, who have really been very critical of the conduct of qualitative research, particularly in nursing. So this got me thinking, and you'll probably see some of those critiques and basis in what I have to say. So my own focus was on phenomenology, but so too you can read different critiques of grounded theory, case study, etc., etc. So we'll unpick that a little bit throughout the presentation. I think I've got to grips with the technology now. At least I can advance the presentation, so we're doing well. So here I have a quote that well, it's not a quote, but it's a statement by O'Cahan from 2014, and her work around the analysis of clinical trials. I'm assuming that many people have come across this piece of work already. And basically, her and her team undertook quite an extensive piece of work and an analysis of qualitative research within trials. And identified these 5 categories, and I'm putting them up there as a reference, and I will come back to them later on. So what they found in their analysis was that articles that were published in relation to the qualitative part of a trial were focusing on these 5 different areas. So there were the actual interventions themselves being trialed, the design and the process, and the conduct of the trial. Focusing on outcomes, the measures used within the trial, and in some instances, the condition or the target condition that was the focus of the trial. So I'll leave that as a reference point because, as I say, I think many people will probably be familiar with that anyway. And she went on again with the rest of her team to identify 3 models or 3 of study. It's the first 2 that I am particularly interested in for the sake of this presentation. And again, I will come back to later. I'm just using it as a starting point, really. What they identified was that qualitative research in trials is tending to be one of 2 things, either peripheral or an add-on. So it's either considered to be something that's lesser status, lesser important, and lesser value than the actual main, the RCT or the trial itself, or something of an addition to it that sometimes is there to persuade funders, for example, of the rigor of the study. But the third point is really important, and I think this is why you get out of bed to do what you do, those of you who are undertaking qualitative research in trials. And that's because it's of equal status and is an equally essential component to any other aspect of that study as a whole. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. And one of my old colleagues, well, she's not old, but she's a colleague of old, if you know what I mean, Mary Wells, and her colleagues a few years ago now also undertook an analysis of complex interventions. And what Mary Wells and her colleagues had to say was that in reporting of qualitative research in complex interventions in trials, the description of the intervention, such as we talked about on the previous slide, is just not enough. They need to be more than that. And then the last point here is that if you're only reporting on the trial itself or the interventions or the outcomes, how useful is that to a much broader audience? And that's what I would leave you to think about, because what the argument here is that it's really potentially only of interest to researchers who are working on a similar intervention, rather than more broadly to a wider population. So now, using that as the basis for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about 2 projects that I've been involved with. Again, asking some questions that are linking to the issue of trials, but appealing also to those people joining the webinar and those people in the room who are undertaking qualitative research per se. So there's a little bit of something for everybody, I'm hoping, in this. So project number 1 was an inquiry into the issue of theory in qualitative research. And a statement here was that a lack of theory in qualitative research is something that undermines its quality. And this was my assumption and the basis of the inquiry. And I've been asked in the presentations around this issue about what do we mean by theory anyway? What is theory? And if we're saying that qualitative research or absence of theory in qualitative research is not a good thing, then anyway, what on earth do we mean by theory? And that's something that myself and my colleagues have debated and written about as we've as we've progressed with our inquiries in this area. So the use of theory can be defined thus, and I won't read it word for word, you have it on the screen in front of you. But it's an organised school of thought. It has assumptions and concepts within it that can often be grounded within our disciplines. So my own discipline of nursing has its own body of knowledge and its own theories, therefore, and the same can be said for many health disciplines. Many of them are psychological theories that we draw upon. And there's 3 levels of theory, and again, I'm just using this as the starting point for, or the basis for discussions and for contextualizing the project. I'm just asking Rena now, is everything okay from a technology point of view? Everything's in hand? Good. So we have scientific theories, the big theories, the Big Bang theory, the theory of evolution, etc., etc. Then we have kind of middle level theories, if you like, or the substantive theories that belong to our disciplines. And that's really what I am talking about largely within this presentation or within this analysis. And then also methodological theory, because I'm going to talk about methodology specifically in the second part of the presentation. So we'll come back to that a little, but there is an argument or a point to be made that the disciplinary knowledge and the methodology knowledge for a qualitative research are so closely intertwined that we can't really separate them. That's one way of viewing the situation. And a lot of our research, I say ours because I take ownership of some of the being part of the qualitative research community, has been criticised as being atheoretical, and I've already referred to some of the critics in that respect. But what another argument by Denzin and Lincoln, this is a few years old, but I think it still stands really, and that is that as beings, as human beings, as qualitative researchers, as thinking beings, we are always approaching the world theoretically, whether we acknowledge that or whether we don't. That we come with a set of assumptions, theories, biases, etc. to our research that we cannot avoid, and actually, for the sake of reflexivity, we shouldn't try to avoid, and that we should acknowledge as part of our endeavour. So I think that's an interesting point for us to acknowledge as well, is that we may have these disciplinary theories, whatever they might be, but we also have our own theories that we bring as individuals to the qualitative endeavour, that it's important to acknowledge. So what I'm saying there really is that actually, when you think about it at a basic level, none of our research can ever truly be atheoretical. It just can't be. So what it's about then really is what we could call unmasking theory, showing it, revealing it, and explaining it. And I might use the word transparency quite a bit in the presentation as well, because it's important for us to be as transparent as we can in our biases and in the assumptions and the theories that we are bringing to our qualitative research. One of the things that I've been working on over the years when I've been researching and thinking and critiquing qualitative research myself is, along with colleagues, and I shall give them acknowledgement as the slides arise, we've developed a methodology called a focused mapping review and synthesis. It's a bit of a mouthful, and I wish that we'd have found a more succinct way of saying it, but we're kind of stuck with it really. So that's what it's called, a focused mapping review and synthesis. And we're just about to publish a paper on that, but that's another story. And it develops the work of Grant and Booth from 2009. And I don't know whether anybody's come across that paper, but it's referenced at the end of this presentation because it's actually a cracking paper. And I really wish that I'd written it myself. They undertook a review of different types of review methodologies, and they identified 14 key types. So, and one of the types of review that they identified is a mapping review. So we built that methodology and have described it in the way that we have developed it. And it is this methodology that we used for the theoretical analysis, and then the methodological analysis that I'm going to describe in a minute. So my message to you now is that if you haven't looked up Grant and Booth and you're interested in reviews, or you're supporting and supervising students who are, then it really is a very good, really very good informative paper. So our focus, mapping, review and synthesis then is focused, really, rather than a broad mapping review. And it's focused in that we focus on a particular subject area, we focus on a specific period of time, which you could say many systematic reviews do also, but what a focused mapping review does is that it also focuses on specific targeted sources of information, mostly journals. So this is what we did for our analysis of theory. Our basic question was to ask, how are researchers using theory in their qualitative research, and how visible is it, and how have they unmasked it? And we looked at 5 different journals. We targeted these ones because they were from health and social care and social sciences. And we retrieved 55 articles that met our inclusion criteria. And what we developed and subsequently published was a typology that we argue presents 5 different ways that researchers deal with theory in their qualitative studies. And I'll talk you through it. I'll need to put my glasses on in order for me to do that properly. And I'd be very interested to have some discussions and debate about this, and I shall tie it into the issue of qualitative research with trials in a little while. So what we argued was that, I'm going to start with 5 and work backwards, I think. Level 5 theory is what we would argue is the gold standard. Level 5 theory is where researchers, qualitative researchers, take a theory, whatever that theory might be, the theory of reasoned action, theories of change, etc., and take that theory and develop their research questions, their qualitative questions, their methodologies, and their analysis based on that theory. So you can see it very visibly throughout the whole of a study. I'm going to leave level 4 for a minute. I'm going to go on to the partial. So what partial use of theory does is it's a paper where you might read and the authors will say, well, in this study, I've used the work of Michel Foucault to analyse power. And then you go on to read the paper, but there's absolutely nothing later mentioned about the work of Foucault and power. That's partially applied. So you're full of hopes to start with, but then it just disappears and vaporizes somehow. Implied, which is level 2, what we meant by that was that there is theory in there. So we'll keep with Michel Foucault because I actually quite like him. You might see reference to Michel Foucault, other theorists, other philosophers, other authors who've written about power, but the authors don't actually state, hey, we've been inspired theoretically by Michel Foucault. It's just peppered with reference to key theorists in the field. So do you see the distinction? And if you don't, and you're joining webinar, just please do raise your hand or ask a question. Those are the 2 different types of partial or implied use of theory that you might see in others' writing. Seemingly absent is that an article, when you're reading it or looking at somebody's work, for example, the student you're supervising, there is a complete absence of any mention of theorists or any theories in that work. And then I will just go back to level 4. Level 4 is retrospectively applied. Now, I'll show you what our analysis revealed in a minute. This is just the framework that we developed and used. Retrospectively applied means that researchers are undertaking a study, generating the data, analysing the data, and then at publication stage, and I would suggest, and this is what we think of as a team, is that then think, oh my goodness me, people keep asking me what's my conceptual and theoretical framework. I didn't have one, so I shall now write about it and pretend I did have one right from the beginning. And they apply it retrospectively. That's level 4 theory. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute and just ask whether or not there's any questions before I move on to the next slide to show what our analysis revealed.
I'm just wondering, did you develop the typology before you did the search, or were you informed by the search to develop the typology? That's all.
Thank you very much for that question, Maura. I was asked whether or not where we developed the typology. I removed a slide yesterday when I was going through the presentation because I thought there were too many slides. It actually detailed how we developed the typology. It was developed theoretically, funnily enough, that we presented at a couple of conferences to test it out and to develop it. So it was developed with a critical audience, and then we used the analysis that I'm going to report on now to test it and refine it. And I might say that it was also refined further as part of the review process for the publication that eventually appears in, because one of our reviewers said, "Are you sure this typology is right?" So it's actually been quite an iterative process that maybe could be subject to further iterations once it's been critiqued. And particularly, and I will end with this, specifically in relation to qualitative researchers who are working within the context of trials. So, because I don't know whether this is fit for purpose or in what way it might be adapted so that it could be fit for purpose within that specific context. So I'll show you what our analysis revealed from our 55 articles. So across the top are the 5 journals that we turn to in order to critique the level of theoretical visibility. So again, it's the unmasking of the theory. And what you can see from that probably is that a majority of articles, there was a seemingly absent theory. The next group of articles were those where theory was partial. Okay, and so partial, if you remember, is where authors have a promise of some kind of theory and then it disappears and is no longer, then it isn't picked up on. And that is the profile of the articles in that respect. And then we were interested because as qualitative researchers, we're always looking for somewhere to publish an outlet for our work, either a qualitative journal per se, qualitative health research, for example, or more of a discipline-specific nursing journal or physiotherapy journal or what have you. And what was obvious from this particular group was that most of the articles came from qualitative health research anyway. And you can just, I mean, I don't suppose I need to really unpick this too much as regards different journals and their theoretical strength. But what did strike us was that if you look at social science and medicine, for example, on the far right-hand side, out of the total journals published in theirs, we found that they were stronger theoretically. So they had a much stronger theoretical base. In our very, somewhat subjective analysis, were theoretically strong. So I guess the messages there are that if you are reading an article from social science and medicine or the like, or wanting to publish there, then it better be theoretically strong, because this is an indicator that that's what they're looking for, or that's the kind of thing that they publish. Yeah, you were asking a question there.
Well, I think you've answered it, because I'm thinking of the criteria for each journal is different.
Yes.
And whether that has an impact on whether somebody writes about theory in depth or in a superficial form.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, so what that social science and medicine are theoretically strong? What does that do to inform practice, for example? I mean, there's lots of different debates to be had in relation to this. So that was the profile. That was a snapshot anyway of a particular group of journals in a particular time frame, and that will shift and change, and a different profile might emerge from a different context, of course. But as regards our analysis, and particularly identifying those 5 different levels, we had something to say. about qualitative research. So the next couple of slides are bringing the theoretical element of the presentation to an end. So what I've had to really be mindful of as I've been publishing my own work over the last number of years is not to shoot myself in the foot. Because if I publish something that is theoretically really weak, or as I'll say in the second part of the presentation, methodologically a bit slurred or sloppy, I'm going to be in trouble. So I really had to make every effort to make sure that when I'm writing something, that the theory does come over in that. And this is just one of the recent publications of mine where I've used with my colleagues, they're all named and acknowledged on that slide, used the common sense model. I don't know whether people are familiar with that as a common sense model. I could just do a presentation on it myself. You just have to look it up. It's about the way that people, their beliefs about a condition or a disease and how that impacts on the way that they approach that disease. For example, the way that they might think about the causes of that, the way they think about the consequences of it. There's 5 different domains that are absolutely fascinating when looking particularly at people's behaviours to something. And in this case, the something was the condition of albinism in Africa. So the overall argument here, or the point I'm making, is that theoretically informed right the way through, level 5 theory is the gold standard. I'd still stand by that and say that that's what we should all be striving for. But there are some challenges. There's a risk, we found it ourselves with the paper I just reported on, we found it in that, is that there is a risk that theory can be so dominant that you end up trying to squeeze everything into that theory. And as qualitative researchers, we will appreciate just how rich and diverse and unexpected qualitative data can be. And how do you deal with that if we're dealing with these very rigid, arguably, domains that many theories would have or require you to look at? What do you do with all the rich extra stuff? Because it's not actually extra, it's people talking about their lives. But that does create a tension and can mean that we might be trying to squeeze something that doesn't quite fit. I love this picture because they are actually square, these marrows. So what we're suggesting is that an adaptation of a theory might be necessary. So we don't want to, I've mentioned Michel Foucault previously. So if we're going to draw on one of his theories or his theory of, or his conceptualization of power, then let's be open to modifying that a little to fit with our qualitative research agenda. And what I've tended to do is to analyze data inductively in a true qualitative way, and then map to a theory so that we're not losing some of that richness. So conclusions then about theory and qualitative research is that theoretical frameworks are to be encouraged and are necessary to drive up quality, I would say, in the qualitative endeavour. We need to be a little bit flexible with our approaches. But transparency, that's going back to that word again, transparency in what we've done and what we were able to achieve are absolutely crucial. And what I would just like to pause to consider, and again, this can either be a rhetorical question for now, and we can take questions at the end, but or we can pause and ask questions in the room or via the webinar in relation to how does this all fit then within the context of qualitative research and trials. And if we have a broader theoretical driver or theoretical framework for the study as a whole, how can we do justice to that within our qualitative component of the research study? Rena, you had a question on the webinar, so.
Question here. So somebody is asking if do you mean the theory? Is it the theory that guided the intervention itself in the study? For example, cognitive behavioural therapy, or is it methodological theory or both? Look about theory, is it about intervention
or about the methodology?
That's a really, really pertinent question. And I think the response to that is both, in that, going back to my previous point in relation to theory and methodology being somewhat inseparable and one informing the other, then my response to that would be both. Yeah.
Another one, yeah. Could you share an example of retrospectively applied paper which were published? I'm interested to know how effective that would be when applied at the end of an entire qualitative study.
What a cracking question. Thank you so much for that. Well, I won't go back to, well, I might. I'll risk going back with my little clicker. I think I've got the hang of it. I'll just go back to this framework to answer that. So if you look at the level 4 in the right hand axis, you'll see that we were able to identify 0 with retrospectively applied theory. And the reason for that is because we can't identify it, paradoxically. So I can never know when you present me with a piece of work or whether I'm reading an article and it talks about Foucault. I don't know why I'm fixated with Foucault. With Foucault, if that's there, I don't know really where that's appeared. All I know intuitively and instinctively and actually experientially is that there is a tendency sometimes to retrospectively apply theory, but you cannot spot it in other people because they mask it. And I don't know, I've got some nods in the room and I can't see whether people in the webinar are nodding, but maybe you can put your thumbs up to say that you understand what I'm talking about. We can't identify it. And this is one.
You get a hunch.
Yeah, you do get a hunch, absolutely. And one reviewer suggested that we remove this. Well, if you can't see it, what's the point of having it in your typology? But actually, we think it's quite important to have it in the typology because we know it goes on. And I probably did it myself in my own PhD, for part of it anyway, because people kept asking me what my theoretical framework was, and I panicked every time I was asked because I didn't really know. So it was iterative, I would say, maybe that rather than retrospectively applied. But I really like those questions, so please do keep them coming. And I hope that answers the question about the retrospectively applied. Maybe it's not until you've done it yourself or until you've seen it in the supervision of students, perhaps, that you can know truly what retrospectively applied looks like. We can't spot it in other people, but you can see it. Okay, so that's the paper. And I put that up there just for reference and also to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper who were really instrumental in the thinking around the theory. And there's a lot more thoughts to be done, particularly to answer this issue of qualitative research in trials, I think. So the state of qualitative research, and I think that this is probably the paper that was instrumental in bringing me here today to run the seminar. It led on sequentially from the theoretical frameworks study, and it was driven by increasing understanding or an increasing awareness, I suppose, of the critiques that have been levied against qualitative research. And myself and my colleagues, and they are acknowledged there, we're interested as qualitative researchers ourselves to inquire as to the state of qualitative research. And we undertook a focused mapping, review and synthesis, and you now know what that is because I've explained it. The state of qualitative research. And we based it quite heavily on the work of Creswell, and he was given due credit throughout, and I sent him the paper, I think, when we published it and kept in contact with him. I am very inspired by the work of Creswell, and I don't know how familiar people are who are joining via the webinar. He started off with really helpful papers and writings about qualitative research that I'm going to say a little bit more about for the purpose of this presentation, and latterly has gone on to concentrate far more on mixed methods and is the editor of the Mixed Methods journal. So if you're not familiar with Creswell, then I would say that you need to get familiar with him, because I think he's got some really important things to say. So as regards to qualitative research, he talked about 5 traditions. So I'm going to ask the people on webinar, and I'm going to ask the people in the room to remind us what these 5 traditions are. I've mentioned some of them already. I might just ask the people on the webinar to type in a few things first, Rena, so you keep an eye out to see if anybody puts forward any points. What are the 5 traditions that we use quite commonly within qualitative research? Something's flashing on my screen, so there must be some action out there. Okay, well, I shall ask people in the room. What do we use?
Narrative inquiry?
Yeah, narrative inquiry. Was that your own? Was that you?
Yes, that was mine.
That was yours, Rena. Well done. What did I use for my PhD? What did I use for my PhD? Here's a test I said before.
No.
Yeah, phenomenology.
Ethnography.
Yeah, ethnography.
Grounded theory.
Yeah, grounded theory. Thank you so much.
Discourse.
Case study?
Yeah, case study. Yeah, yes. I mean, these are the 5 traditions that Creswell talks about. And I don't know about other people here, but I tend to use, I give my publications and studies a nickname or a working name until I have to come up with a proper title. So because Creswell has these 5 traditions, I kind of playfully call this the Big 5 paper, and I do spend quite a bit of time in Africa undertaking studies. The albinism study was an example of that. So we called it the Big 5, as in the Big 5 game. So now I'm going to do a little bit more of a quiz. What are the Big 5? The Big 5 animals. Webinar people, come on, join in.
Elephant.
Yeah, elephant.
Hippo.
Sorry?
Hippo.
Not hippo, it's quite big, but not a Big 5.
Lion.
Yeah, lion.
Giraffe.
No, tall but not big.
Rhino. Buffalo.
Yeah, rhino, buffalo, the Cape buffalo. Yeah. Any more from the back?
We need to even get there.
Oh, good grief. Ah, there we are. Big 5. Yeah, you missed a leopard. Beautiful leopard. What a lovely animal. Okay. So this was just called the Big 5 paper. In fact, we would nearly put it in the title, but we didn't think we'd get away with it, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So Creswell, 2007, updated in 2013. Really helpful. Now, if you are new to qualitative research yourself and you're trying to grapple with the different elements of it, I know I did, or you're supervising a student who is struggling with what on earth is the difference between grounded theory and narrative, what does a case study mean? This is adapted from Creswell's breakdown of the different types of qualitative approaches. He called them traditions to start with, and then in 2013 called them approaches. And what we did in our analysis was use those 5 domains, which is why I've spent a bit of time talking about them. We used the Big 5 domains, and we took the work of Pawson and colleagues, this was just Pawson, sorry, who talked about, this is another interesting paper that I have provided the references for you, talked about orientation. So that's the way that we approach our research, including the theoretical orientation, the philosophical orientation, the techniques that were meant to be the things we actually do or say that we've done within research, and then the patterning, so the patterns between those and what our research actually looks like in the end. Orientation, technique, patterning are really important to this particular analysis. And what we were interested in, we don't have to read this, it's just for reference, or if the slides are available afterwards, this is specifically what we wanted to do. Basically to look to a group of articles, qualitative articles, and look at the orientation and the technique. What do researchers say they're doing, and what do they actually seem to be doing? Am I okay for time, by the way? Yeah? Yep, okay. And this was our second focus mapping review. We've gone on to do quite a number of them, but this was focus mapping review number 2, the state of qualitative research. And we looked in a group of journals, 6 different journals for this particular analysis. And this was quite a big review in that we ended up with 102 articles included in it. So quite a lot to analyse and to scrutinise for orientation and technique. And our analysis wasn't robust. We actually used Excel spreadsheet. And if you can see this well enough, you can see on the top, we were extracting data in relation to orientation and technique. This was the nice organized me from a computer point of view. This was actually the reality. This was my desk. No, it wasn't my desk. This was my floor, even in my office. Fortunately, I have a very long office. So this was what it looked like. And it was quite in-depth. Well, it was an in-depth, complex process. And I put this little illustration of the shocked baby because basically what we were looking at was orientation technique. What are researchers telling us they're doing? And as a research team, we had to keep coming together to say, what is it that we're looking for here? We're looking for what researchers say they do, but what's right, what's wrong, what judgments can we make about this that are going to be fair? And we came to the conclusion that as really experienced qualitative researchers undertaking this analysis, we were looking for the things that surprised us, the things that shocked us. So if a researcher was saying that they were using grounded theory, for example, we were looking for the little surprises whereby it didn't look like a grounded theory study. And one of our colleagues in particular is very well published in the field of grounded theory. It's less of an area of expertise for myself. So that's what we were looking for, those kind of points where we were surprised by what people were saying, because to us, that alerted us to the fact that something might not be quite right here with the reporting of this qualitative study, with the state of qualitative research. So I had a few things to say about that, from which there are lessons to be learned, I think. So here's an analysis of the qualitative studies, the journals. And we were wanting to retrieve articles that were qualitative, and we were absolutely surprised by how difficult it was sometimes to find the articles, because they didn't tell us that they were qualitative articles, which was a real challenge. So that was the first thing we wanted to report on, was out of these 102 articles, how many of them are actually telling us in the article that this is a qualitative study, or that it's some form of qualitative study? And we were really surprised by just how many didn't tell us. I had to really look. And there was one study, I must say, that even after reading and circulating around the whole of the team, we were still not convinced whether or not it was a qualitative study or not. So it called itself a qualitative study, but actually it had loads of statistics in it. So we were actually created quite a lot of debate about whether or not it was actually truly qualitative. And a lot, as in the middle column, 46 of the articles were implied in some way. So there was a quotation in the title that made it look like it was probably a qualitative article, but didn't actually say. And this was the breakdown of the big five across the articles and across the journals that we analysed. And we can see, for example, a couple of interesting things here. We had I sense that there's somebody very into ethnography in the audience here. So ethnography was quite a popular approach as regards this particular group of articles retrieved from these particular group of journals. Particularly in journals such as Social Science and Medicine and Sociology of Health and Illness, you could say that that probably makes sense. So if I was going to publish an ethnographic study and it was theoretically and methodologically robust, then I would be thinking about one of those journals as being quite maybe a journal who would be interested in my article. What I wanted to refer to is the penultimate column, the generic studies, because this was a group of articles who didn't say that they were adhering to any of the big five. They were just saying, here we have it, this is a qualitative study. And when we looked at the patterning, and when we looked at the level of alignment between whether the orientation that authors were saying that they were adhering to and the techniques that they used and the general patterning between them, whether or not they had achieved that to a high level, a partial level, or a low level, what we found was that in the group of articles who didn't align themselves to any of the big five, the generic group of articles, that they were far more likely to have consistency and congruency between what they said they did and what they actually did. The partial group were articles, for example, to give you an illustration, were articles who didn't say that they were undertaking a grounded theory study. Some of them might say, for example, this is a phenomenological study. And then the surprise element came when they were describing their analysis and they used words that were more aligned to grounded theory, constant comparison, for example. Now, to us, that was not always very well described and didn't persuade us often that these researchers were very clear about what they were doing or why they were doing it and had not been desperately transparent. So the take-home message from this particular table is really just how important it is to align yourself with or describe what you're doing as being a generic qualitative study and not claim to be one of the other big five if that's not the case or if you're not clear about it. So it's much safer to stay simple. Please do challenge me as we're going along.
Can I ask a question?
Of course you can. Yeah, we're fine because we
I will forget. When you say generic there, do you mean generic in the description of Sanjalowski's descriptive qualitative, or just they mentioned the word qualitative and moved on?
Well, that's a very good point because you've mentioned the word descriptive. We were not quite sure what to call this. We were saying that now should we just say that this, should we say that this is this category of papers who are not claiming to use any of the big five, should we say that these are the descriptive qualitative studies? Or should we say that these are the generic qualitative studies? Or what do we call them? We went along with the words generic because that was just the words that were used in a few of the articles themselves to describe what they were doing. But that's a really good point. But you could take it to also be descriptive. That's a comparable what's the word? A comparable way of looking at it. We veered away from the term descriptive because part of our analysis is about the level of robustness and critique of the papers, and the word descriptive can sometimes, we felt, be misinterpreted. And I use the word descriptive in feedback to students or in reviewing articles saying that this is too descriptive, meaning a kind of fairly negative thing. Generic is, in our use of the word, means those studies where researchers are not claiming to be having their research grounded in one of the big five. So we've now produced a table that is about the big six, really. Wow. Okay. So what is the state of qualitative research then? And I am coming to the end of the session fairly soon, so if anybody's panicking about time, don't worry, we are good. First thing to say is that it's often very difficult to tell whether or not a study is qualitative or not. Now, we're proud to be qualitative researchers. We want our qualitative research to be read. So a message here is when publishing ourselves or encouraging or supporting others to publish, think about what we're doing with our titles, make our qualitative research easy to find. Maybe again in guiding students or supporting more novice researchers is to guard against being overzealous with one's claims to being undertaking phenomenology, grounded theory, etc. if you're not sure you are. And just stick and say, hey, this is a generic study, a generic qualitative study. Hopefully that will be theoretically robust, it'll be very well informed methodologically, but it's not claiming to be one of the big 5 because that's the group of papers that were the most modelled. And it's better to stay simple. And we, in our thinking and our developing of this, we then developed a wheel that we hoped would build on the inquiry that we'd undertaken on Creswell's Big 5 and present the Big 6. So this is what we published in that article, a level of alignment wheel. So what we did here was took each of the Big 5 and our generic category, which is the pink, we put it into this wheel as an attempt to show or to help researchers, particularly the more junior or researchers or those who are learning about qualitative approaches, to help show what might belong where in a way that's congruent and helpful. And I've been asked about this as to, well, are you saying that you can never cross over from 1 to the 2? Can you twist this wheel? And originally I'd wanted to make this into a twistable kind, and I maybe still do somewhere along the line, so that we can rotate it through the different colours to see what different aspects of a study might look like. The important thing here is, and I'll go on to the next slide to show it in a little bit more clarity. If you are undertaking a phenomenological study, for example, in the yellow bracket, then this diagram shows you what the yellow phenomenological field looks like. Yeah?
I think the group statements, that's very difficult, and you wouldn't normally see that.
No.
I'm just curious about, yeah, including that there.
This particular, I've kept this pretty tightly around the 5 as described by Creswell. Yeah, sure. So as not to misinterpret some of the things that were originally said or the approaches. And well, we might say more, it's something that we could be critical. Yeah, sure. Yeah. There's bits about this level of alignment wheel that, since it's been published, I could look at quite critically and think, oh, maybe I might just have the liberty to tweak that, or develop it further. On my very last slide in a minute, I will just say about where we could go with this, and particularly in the context of trials. So what it's suggesting is not that we have to stick rigidly within the yellow or that this is gospel. What it's trying to show is that, from a technique and orientation point of view, most times this is what it might look like.
Yeah, because there's a phenomenological georgized approach you can use with case studies.
Yeah.
So you
sure.
Go, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, some of the papers, I didn't point this out in the analysis, but some of the best papers that we analysed and we put up as the gold standard examples were really cracking articles from very good journals. I won't name them, but you can read the paper and find out. I think we say that these are really good examples because they have managed to combine, and they say that they've combined grounded theory, phenomenology, and taken different aspects of them, put them together because that's what their study has called for. But they know that they've done it, they've explained it really well, and they've critiqued it. And I think that's the important thing. They know what they've done and they've described it. Yeah. Have you got a question, did you say? Okay. Shall I take those now, or shall I just show the last pink one?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is the pink one. So this is the pink segment, and this is what generic research looks like. And I could say that maybe some of this pink category belongs in some of the others as well. So please don't interpret this segmentation as being boundaried. It's not. And in a previous iteration, there were also circles indicating that we could move this around a little bit. But if we're going to move around, the message is do it knowingly and describe that that's what you've done and take ownership of it and report it. So I'll just leave that up there. What were the questions from
You've
the...
actually answered, that's the question.
Oh.
Can you clarify thematic analysis and content analysis and where they fit with the big 5?
Yeah, okay.
And then there's another question, and thank you for a very compelling talk. Can you share how epistemology fits with this topic? I think that might relate maybe to the theory.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how interpretivism, for example, fits with RCT, which is presumably positivist.
Yeah, okay.
And there's another one then. If level 5 is gold standard, what if there isn't a clear theoretical framework, and therefore you adopt a more pragmatic approach? Does this reduce the value of the work potentially?
Those are really, there's quite a lot of questions there, isn't there? The question about the interpretivist and the positivist framework and how those fit together are big debates in the fields of mixed methods research, for sure. And one perspective is that they don't fit together, but then from a pragmatic point of view, and I know a lot of people engaged in this type of work do take a pragmatic approach to their research to recognize those different world views. And I think that is a very good question, because it is one of the conundrums, really. So what I'm going, and this might just pick up on some of those questions there, and if it doesn't, we've got 2 minutes left. These are the last 2 slides, I think, that I have to present. This is a question. Having presented on the theory and the state of qualitative research and the conclusions that I've come to, wanted to ask really, is it possible? Is it necessary? Or is it desirable to use those elements of the QR law, the wheel, as a framework for qualitative research and trials? Where does it fit? Is it of any use whatsoever in informing qualitative research, specifically with trials? And what I'll go back to really is some of the theorists with or some of the writings, and with the addition more recently of Moore and colleagues from 2015, to just maybe just highlight some of the aspirations around this, is that that might help to reconcile some of those things or address them, is that within study design, it's important, if we're really going to value qualitative research and not have it as peripheral or as an add-on, to design the study and not just the trial. So we're always keeping that qualitative element as of equally important status, so that there's synergy between the different strands of that study as a whole. That and the bottom 2 really are just referring back to the importance of theory, and that is the same for broadly qualitative research, but also in the context of trials. And what I want to close really with is just recognizing the remit of quests around support, training, and also research in this area. And to say maybe, and this is an invitation or a challenge or something for further communication, is to say, can we think about how the theoretical typology or the level of alignment wheel, that colourful diagram, might be used as an appraisal tool? Not everybody's up for appraisal tools, of course, or an assessment of our own work in this area. There's work to be done, maybe we could do it, and this webinar and discussion might open that up. And is there more research to be done that we could move forward and perhaps think about doing together, or at least in an informed way across different organisations and sectors? And I thank you for that. And there's some references if you need them. Thank you very much for very much for that.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. That was really fascinating, and it was the alignment wheel that got me really interested in your work. So I think that's a huge contribution. So thank you very much. And thank you for your time and your effort. Thank you to everybody on the webinar for your questions and your comments. And I hope you all found it very useful. So thank you very much.